G'day everyone and welcome to 7 Questions, a podcast that shares the stories and compelling lessons from founders, investors and leaders shaping our economy. I'm your host, Wayne Gerard, founder and investor at Partner. Through 7 Questions, we explore the founder and growth company journey from idea to exit, uncovering the insights, lessons and defining moments that shaped each founder and the companies they're building. Whether you're a first-time founder, a serial entrepreneur, an investor, a board member, or a customer, someone looking for insights on entrepreneurship and what it takes to build a world-class company. These conversations are designed to inspire you, to get you thinking, and hopefully you'll find some timely wisdom that propels your journey. Welcome to Season 2 of 7 Questions. I'm your host, Wayne Gerard, and this season we're talking about high growth company governance. What's it like to support some of Australia's fastest growing and most potential companies from a governance perspective, from a board perspective? How do boards help high growth companies really achieve their maximum potential? Today, I'm joined by a super good friend of mine, Jacqui Walters. She has been an incredible board member across a range of organisations, both in size and industry, for a long time. I've known Jacqui for over 10 years. I met her when she founded an innovation advisory firm called Era Innovation. Jacqui's got an incredible career. She brings a stack of experience as a director of really large established organisations, as a director and chair of greenfields organisations. Like Jacqui literally was engaged by the Queensland government to create CleanCo. And so I'm sure we'll learn some lessons from that. And Jacqui's also advised and supported early stage, high growth, scale up organisations. Right now, Jacqui's working with a company, a really large company, and divesting a new business and setting it up from scratch. So talk about a breadth of experience and skills. I'm super excited to have this conversation with Jacqui Walters. Welcome, Jacqui.
Thanks, Wayne. I'm really happy to be here, and it's a subject that's dear to my heart.
It's amazing that governance can be exciting, but both you and I are excited by the opportunity to help companies grow and to put right time, right size governance around them. So before we dig into 7 questions, Jacqui, it would be great to help the audience to get to know you. Would you just walk us through your background, talk a little bit about your journey and how you ended up with such a diverse experience across a range of organisations and boards?
I will. I mean, my husband says I've got a short attention span, which explains why I've worked across so many different types of businesses. But I did an accounting degree, so I got a finance and commerce degree, and then worked as a management consultant, mostly overseas. So I worked a lot internationally for the first at least half of my career. And that was spent mostly in implementing really large ERP systems. It was that first wave of them, followed by a lot of work on transformation strategy and growth. Worked across many different industries in many different countries and lived and worked in a lot of different places. I landed in Queensland, had my daughter and had to sort of settle down a bit, but continued working as a management consultant and started to spend a lot of time in the infrastructure space. And that led me to a role with a very newly established, or it was being established, statutory authority, Building Queensland. And that was my first non-executive director role, and also standing up new functions like a new audit and risk committee and just the general board rhythm. And from there, I've gone on to have other non-exec director roles, as well as founding Era Innovation and doing other consulting on top of that. Most of my board roles until recently have been with companies that have been going through either significant growth or some sort of transformative journey where there's been a lot of volatility and a lot of agility required. And so I still mix up doing a bit of hands-on consulting with board roles. I think it's really important to keep it real and also to keep your knowledge contemporary. So right now I'm on the board of Port of Brisbane and Transurban Queensland, but recently stepped down from the board of Slater and Gordon, where I went in there with the private equity firm to do a big turnaround. And if you were paying attention to the headlines, Many times over the last 10 years, Slater and Gordon nearly went under, first listed law firm in Australia, and we took it through recapitalisation, delisting, and a great growth journey. So that's just one of the examples of the types of roles that I've had.
Jacqui, what an incredibly diverse set of experiences and appointments that you've had, and all those things coming together to shape the way you think about governance and helping growth companies to really scale. So let's start 7 questions with question number 1, which is, at what point should a growth company begin to formalize its governance? At what point should the business owner or the founder or the CEO be thinking about putting a board in place?
We've talked before about the fact there's no sort of recipe for this. There's no one size fits all. I think there's a few symptoms that start to emerge, and one of them is that the founder, who often is the decision maker for everything, starts to become a bottleneck for decisions to be made. So it's not necessarily that they're not capable of making the decision. It's just that there's too much stuff coming to them. And so that can be a good indicator that you need to put a little bit of governance in place to have some different decision-making rights and some delegation. And often I think that is the first step in governance, is to decide that there's going to be a division of duties, and getting some clarity and some formality around that is important. So I think that's one indicator. I think the second strongest one is where you recognise that you're too immersed, almost emotionally, in what you're building, and you need some sort of sounding board or a fresh set of eyes, a slightly unbiased viewpoint that allows you to have someone that you can use as a sounding board and to challenge. Often people have those sorts of advisors. They might be formal or informal, but I think there's a certain point where that becomes something you need all the time, and you need someone to really understand what's going on in the business and to have some mutual sort of accountability so that they can really play that role well. Whether it's an advisory board or a governance board, I think even if it's really small, having that formality really helps. Get the fresh set of eyes on decisions, but also that sort of delegation of authority, and maybe shifting some decisions into that board environment to have a bit of a separation between the really day-to-day operational stuff and the more strategic decisions.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, Jacqui. I think back to my journey when we founded Red Eye, and we were about maybe 18 months into the journey. And literally, I can remember a week where we got an inbound inquiry from Peru, an inbound inquiry from Hong Kong, and an inbound inquiry from South Africa, all in one week. And we were doing no external marketing. And that, for me, was a trigger to go, wow, I think we're onto something bigger than what we anticipated. And the opportunity and the consequences are bigger than what I realized. And I probably need to surround myself with some people that have been there, done it, and can help me. So that kind of brings me to question number 2, which is, where do people start? So they've decided, whether they're a business owner, a founder, a CEO, whatever title they are, they've decided that, the business is at a stage where they need or want to put in place some, a board, an advisory board, a better governance framework. What's your advice? Where should they start? How do they start? Who do they ask for help? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think the first thing they need to be thinking about is, what do they feel they need help with? Some founders are very confident about their ability to cover the space that they're trying to execute in. So they're not looking for knowledge, but they might be looking for that experience that you mentioned, someone who's been through this before. But also, depending on who they've got around them, they might be looking for a bit of a diversity of thought as well, because I think groupthink's something that can really happen if you're not careful when you're in that little hothouse of, building a new business with a small, close group of team members. So I think thinking about, what is it I'm really looking for here, and really having clarity and sticking to that, because people will have all sorts of formulas they want to bring in. You need this, and this is what it looks like. And every business is different. Every business culture is different. and every founder is different. So you've really got to understand that for yourself and kind of stay true to it. I think the other thing is, instead of thinking about structure, and I'd say the same about when you're designing an org structure for a business, firstly, think about who has authority and is making decisions. So if I'm a founder, I need to be really clear. What are the things that I think I'd be comfortable allowing a board to participate in and sort of own some decisions? Even though I'm a member of that board, I'm inviting some outsiders in to help me with these decisions. What are the ones I'm going to be really comfortable with? And I think starting in those two places, absolute clarity about what it is you want this board to be able to do for you, rather than just sort of some cosmetic veneer of governance, but also being really clear about what decisions you want them to sort of have authority around versus the ones that you're not prepared to give up. And how do you design around that? I think they're really important starting points, and just reinforcing that there is no formula. There's, of course, good governance principles, and you can apply them to any model, but sort of taking a recipe book and trying to apply it to your unique circumstance is a recipe for disaster, typically.
Hey, I've got a couple of questions for you. Firstly, what do you think about, founders, business owners, CEOs going and doing something like the company directors course so that they get some sense of understanding around what good boards and governance is? That's the first thing. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a reasonable starting point or in your list of starting points?
I think it is at the right time. I mean, the company directors course is sort of the foundational director course in Australia. And it's a big commitment as well. You've got to have the time to commit to it. It's, costs you money. So you've got to be able to do it at a time where you've got the mental bandwidth to be able to take it on. There's a lot of good resources around that you can probably tap into if, you're not yet able to free up that time. But having said that, it's better to do that earlier and gain that understanding, I think, earlier rather than later. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what a board is, the value a board can bring. And that's probably the area I think is probably most misunderstood in some ways. If you speak to people and they say, "What do you do?" I say, "I'm on a board." And they go, "Oh, that's, lots of money for doing not much, pretty cushy role." And just a real lack of understanding of, the value a board can bring to a management team to really strengthen that business and that business's growth. So I think being able to get into that as a founder and an owner of a business, if they do take that time, it gives them the opportunity to really reflect about what is the model that will be right for my business, and just sort of knowing that from the beginning rather than trying to retrofit when you've had a few mishaps is probably a better way to go about it. But I do think whether it's self-education, doing a formal course, but committing some time to really think and reflect, what is it that we need? What value do I think I could get from that sort of governance function is important. And it kind of comes back to what we spoke about in the first question, is having absolute clarity about what you think that board could bring to your business.
Which brings me on to the second kind of point I wanted to make. And that is, when I think about where could a company start? Where could a founder or a business owner start? You said before, there's no recipe book you can follow, right? But I do believe, back to your first point, it's about what do you want that board to do? And what are the kind of people you need around that table? And so for me, I like to think in terms of the voices. What voices do I need around the table? Do I need a voice of the customer? Do I need a voice of someone that's scaled this business before? Do I need the voice of someone like an investor because I need to raise capital for this business? Do I need the voice of some specific area, function, or experience that I want to add to my board table, so to speak? And rather than taking a standard like, I need to have these 5 roles or these 3 roles, but really thinking through, what do I need? What does my business need based on where I'm at? What are your thoughts on the different voices?
I think, you're spot on. You've got to be really thinking through what do I want to get from those conversations around the boardroom table. You probably don't want just more of what you already know and your experience, but typically I think starting with a smaller board is a healthy way to start when you're just sort of setting up a board rather than having a large group of people all at once, gradually building the board. Often, and it depends what your end journey is going to be, but whether you think you're ultimately going to sell a business or you're going to seek investment in your business, there's a certain degree of rigor that you need to be able to demonstrate. So people will often start with looking at not just compliance, but kind of that audit and risk, making sure that we've got that done well. I think that's not a bad place to start in terms of if you don't have any particular skill sets or perspectives that you think need to be represented right now, but as a starting point, that would be one of the first appointments I would make. But having said that, you've got to be very deliberate about bringing people in who have worked in or you think can really work in a very immature environment.
Yeah.
And that's been my experience over many years now is there are some people who are fantastic at working in a mature business, status quo, they can run it beautifully, they bring all sorts of value, they can contribute to operational excellence and incremental value creation. And there are some people who are great at coming in and helping figure out what are the top 5 things we need to do this year. Let's forget all the rest of the noise. Let's live with imperfection and really focus on those things. So coming into an immature environment, dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty about what are things going to look like even in 12 months' time, they're very different types of people. And if you bring someone who's used to that really mature environment into your very immature board and company, it can be quite challenging and not very productive at all because you spend a lot of time applying things to your business that probably aren't going to create value for you and shouldn't be your highest priority. So it's not just can they represent the customer? Can they represent a key stakeholder? Do they understand ESG? Whatever the things are that you think you want to strengthen and that are the most important in those early stages, the type of person and their ability to cut through the chaff and know exactly, contribute to that decision about, well, we can't do everything. We're small, we're resource constrained. These are the most important things. And then commit to that and live with, as I said, that imperfection or roughness in other areas. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, if you're thinking about a high growth company at the moment, an early stage high growth company specifically, there are so many things happening externally, like AI, like changing regulatory environment, like the geopolitical context, like tariffs. There's so many things that if you're trying to scale your company really quickly in this landscape at the moment, you need people who can support you operating in this environment. And to the degree that there is a high level of ambiguity, the degree that there is a fair amount of speed that needs to happen in the decision-making process, and the fact that things can change relatively quickly, you need a board that is comfortable operating in that framework. That brings me on to question number 3, which is, for those high growth companies out there, what's some of your experience or your advice when you think about how do you balance introducing governance? So, what's the right governance at the right time, at the right size, so that you can preserve the entrepreneurial spirit, the culture that made the company attractive and successful in the first place?
Yeah, it's one of the most important things that as a founder, you've got to focus on, and whoever you bring into your boardroom, that you've all got to have a shared understanding of what are the things that have made us successful to date that we want to preserve and how do we make sure that that happens. Partly that comes back to that there is no formula and there is no recipe. There are some fundamentals, of course, that, everyone should have in place if they want to have good governance. But I have seen way too many times the governance from a mature company imposed on whether it's a part of, like the sort of growth part of a mature company. Often, you see that happen where there's some sort of a spin out, but it's still got all of the bureaucracy of the big mothership and it just strangles it to death. I think that you've got to tailor the governance to where your business is at and your risk appetite. And that's something that an external board member can really help you think through is what is your risk appetite? And based on that, what is it that you're going to focus on in terms of governance? And what are the things that you're prepared to live with? Risk and opportunity are sort of two sides of the same coin. So you want to be able to be agile and seize opportunity. You may want to be able to continue to empower your team, but you've got to have absolute clarity about the guardrails. What are the things that we're not prepared to go beyond, and what are the rules around that? And that's really what governance is. I do see often, and it often comes from board members who haven't worked in a startup, scale-up sort of environment where, for example, an investment case, they expect to see a big, mature business case that maps out everything that is expected to happen until that initiative is delivered. And when we're in scale-up, startup mode, that's just like writing a fairy tale. It's like, well, here's what we wish would happen. And that's not a good way to approach those decisions. So the imposition of having to develop a great big business case with a bunch of assumptions that are just kind of made up is not helpful to the business. So how do you tailor the process so that you can make that investment decision knowing there's a bunch of stuff you don't know, but knowing there are some things you do know, and what's the logical order in which you work through the rest of it and keep incrementally making those investment decisions rather than imposing a big, mature sort of process on a business that's never going to be able to step up to that. Being able to really think through what are the risks we're prepared to take, what are the rules about that, and then how do we build that into our decision making, rather than taking an approach of we're going to have a business case for everything and it's going to look like this. It will constrain the speed of decision making. It will suck in lots of resources that are not creating value for the business. So think about the risk that you're prepared to take. What are the guardrails you want to put in place? And then how do you build the business rules around?
A great example of that might be in the tech growth space. When's the right time to get ISO 27001 certification? When's the right time to implement things like business continuity into your technology stack? So when do you build all that resilience into your tech stack? You don't want to start with those things really early because they're expensive and they're time consuming, and you just don't have the capacity, the resource capacity. So what's the right time and what's the right size for you to introduce these governance frameworks that are kind of fit for purpose and will mitigate risk once the risk becomes material and not beforehand, right? It's fascinating, right? Like that right time, right size thing is, I think, requires hindsight often and experience. What do you think?
I think so. And definitely hindsight's always very handy. I think risk has a pretty bad reputation as a function, and sometimes it's well deserved. But really spending some time thinking about that risk question and what do you really think the risks are and what is acceptable to you? And that will be determined by so many different things. Where is this business heading? If you know you need to have some of those certifications to win the big customers and the contracts, then it may make sense that you're sort of investing ahead of the curve because otherwise you're not going to be in the game. Even if you don't have those sorts of imperatives where you've got to overinvest in some governance in order to be able to participate in the market that you want to participate in, there will still be aspects of those frameworks that are very useful for your business, and it's a matter of choosing the right ones. I think that hindsight question and being able to tap into people who've gone through a similar journey and have got those scars on their back, whether it is a business continuity problem, whether it's a cyber attack, whether it's losing your key people when you've got such a small team and half your knowledge walks out the door. It's not just all about process and systems. It's about the capability of your team and how do you hang that together on the way through, which is a massive risk. So, really thinking through what are the key risks for this business at the moment. I feel like I'm repeating myself a bit here on the question of risk, but properly investing and thinking about that and tapping into people. And they don't have to be board members. They can just be people who you observe around you, who have gone through something and who you can have a conversation with. My experience is people are very, very generous with their lessons learned and their experiences because they want other people to be successful. Having a board that has some of that experience and the ability to be able to communicate to you and to your key people about why this is important. We're not just doing this because we want to make your life difficult. We're not just trying to layer in some red tape here. There's a real reason why we need to do this. And I find that's probably where I spend a lot of my time, is building that bridge between what you know because you've been through it and it was hard and next time I do it differently, to the founder and the founder's sort of team who just want to get on with stuff and they've been going really well, and you sort of saying to them, hey, a little bit of caution here, or maybe we need to have a few more checks and balances. You've got to be really clear about the rationale. So people who can communicate that really well, I think it's a real strength for the board if you can achieve that.
I totally agree. And I think back to a couple of the points you made earlier, specifically if you kind of know where the company is going. For example, if you know that you're going to raise capital, then what are some of the things that you need to put in place, some of the governance frameworks around financial management, financial reporting, that it's just going to actually help you raise capital? Or if you're a health tech, med tech, biotech company and you need to get regulatory approval, what are some of the things that you need to put in place now? Some of the tracking of the way you're building your products and the tests you're doing and the performance of those tests and all the reporting that you're going to need to actually go get that governance when you're ready for it. I think having a good board around you can help to introduce some of those things at the right time so that you're not playing kind of catch up footy, at the 11th hour. And I think that's a really valuable aspect of the hindsight that directors get, having done multiple organisations, board roles across multiple organisations. Let's jump on to question 4. And it's really a question about what are the signs that a growth company is going through a kind of turbulent time and is likely to outgrow its existing governance model or governance framework or board? What are some of the signs of that? And who surfaces that? How does it get surfaced? How should it be dealt with? What's some advice for founders who feel like they're probably outgrowing the current governance model?
How does it surface? I think speed of decision making. I also think that confusion about accountability can be a good indicator that the business has changed, but the governance model hasn't kept up with it. Yeah, I think, there's rub points that appear. Decisions aren't being made fast enough. Everyone's got to go to person X, but it doesn't make sense anymore because we're all waiting on them to make a decision. We've grown 10 times and yet our thresholds for where we can make decisions are too low. So they're kind of pretty easy mechanics to fix, those sorts of things. I think there's a cultural aspect to this as well, where if you've come through that sort of hothouse founder environment where it's all hands on deck and everyone's just doing whatever they can, and you have to be prepared to do something that might be very complex and then something that's very mundane because that's what the business needs at the time. So that's where some of that sort of accountability and who does what becomes a bit confused. And at a certain scale, you need to put a bit more definition to people's roles and what your expectations are of them. So I think where you get those friction points where there's a mismatch of expectations, it can often come back to that. And if it's not dealt with fairly quickly, it can turn into a big deal. And that's where you get good people leaving. I think the other area, and I spoke a bit about cultural, is if you are trying to look for that sort of division between day-to-day management, get work done versus a bit more of a strategic assurance type role, which is what the board plays, there needs to be a deliberateness at some point, because even when you have an early board in place, it's often roll your sleeves up and it's a semi-executive role. And there's certain points where you realise the board needs to get back over the fence and play their role. And it only happens at a certain point of maturity where management has got the right resources and capability. You've got mature enough processes and systems where things are running well, and you don't need the board to be able to sort of lean into that semi-operational function. And again, I think you start to see friction appearing where management is saying, get out of our business, we're perfectly competent and able to do this. And Again, you need to pick up those weak signals quickly because it can lead to a real deterioration in the relationship between management and board, depending on what structures you've got in place. But those weak signals, I think, can lead to a very rapid deterioration of trust amongst people. And that is a real problem because if you don't have trust between anyone playing some sort of a board role with management, things become very difficult. So if I was advising a founder, I'd be saying, pay attention to those early friction indicators because there's probably a simple answer and it is a matter of just whether it's position descriptions, whether it's accountabilities, whether it's authority to make certain decisions, even key performance indicators, some of those simple things that say, here's what everyone's responsible for and here's what we're going to collectively hold one another accountable for. It can overcome those friction points, but it's easy to ignore those friction points when you're busy and your business is growing really quickly and HR issues are the last thing that you want to deal with. So don't ignore them because they can really become a big problem. And it's often the governance around the way the business is running that is behind it or can help to sort it out a bit.
When you think about some of the earlier stage companies or the growth companies you've worked with, have you ever seen a situation where the the board was put in place early, the company's growing, and the board, some of the people on the board were great for that really early phase, but then maybe not the right people for the next phase? And how do you deal with that?
Ultimately, you've got to have candid discussions about what the business needs. You need to have a plan for a board just like you do your organisation. It's so underbaked, typically, the whole idea of succession planning, particularly in early stage companies, because you can't imagine that you won't be around to drive this through and you can't imagine handing the reins to anyone else. But you need to imagine it because if something does happen, you've got to know that there's someone who can step in. I think the other thing is sort of how am I developing these people that I'm really relying on as part of my core team? So that's kind of a management issue. From a board perspective, it's the responsibility of the chair, even if you've only got 2 board members, to be really clear about what this board must be able to do for the business at the moment and to review that on at least an annual basis. But in a fast growing business, I'd say at least every 6 months, you want to be saying, have we got the right people around the table here? Do we need to think about bringing another board member in? Maybe whoever we had at the beginning, their skill set doesn't fit so much. So you have a conversation with them about a respectful and managed exit. You don't let them sit around the board table getting ignored because they're not playing any value anymore. They've been fundamental to your success to get to that point. So you've got to treat them respectfully. You've got to have a plan for the board and how you think it's going to evolve. Setting people's expectations at the beginning is a good start because if they know that this might be a short and evolving sort of role, then, that's half the problem dealt with. But, having a bit of discipline around reviewing yourself and your effectiveness as a board and how do we need to change the makeup of what we're doing. It doesn't have to be a great big exercise, but it's like so many things. Just schedule it, take the time, pause and think deliberately about it.
I really love that, Jacqui. One of the things I've been thinking about with a couple of the boards I'm on is thinking about how do you word something like that into a board charter so that the entire board is really comfortable with the fact that the board's there to help the company achieve outcomes and that we're going to constantly review the board to make sure that we've got the best possible board for the stage that the company's at. And that positioning up front, like you said, like have those early upfront conversations with people that come into a governance role to say, hey, you're here for, I like to think about, people are here for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. And often it's a season on a board. You're here for a season to achieve some outcomes, to help the company get from A to B, to add value in an area where you've got experience, context, and hindsight and all those things. But ultimately, hopefully, you do your job so well that the business grows beyond that. And you need the next set of seasoned performers who can take it to the next stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been involved in interviews for roles with companies where the owners have been really clear that we want you to come and play this role. And it's very clear. It's a finite period of time, and there's a very clear point where you may not be required anymore, but which is perfectly fine. And dealing with that up front is a much easier way to deal with it. We'll become emotionally attached to the business. Doesn't mean they don't go on to stay as a friend of the business, but having passengers around the board table is not a good thing.
That brings me to question number 5, which is, what, in your experience, what are some of the experiences you've had where you've seen the board has added a stack of value to a growth company? What are some of the ways that boards really do add great value?
I think it goes without saying, really, that just people's experience of having been on the journey and being able to give a heads up to a founder, look out for this, these are going to be speed bumps. That's kind of goes without saying, I think. One experience I had was a company that was developing a novel. It was in the food sector and they were developing a novel product. I was actually brought in from one of their investors who said, we're a bit worried about what's going on here. We continue to invest. We can see progress, but we've got some areas that we're concerned about. And that business was investing significant amount of capital in new technology, which resulted in a new type of product being able to be produced. But what was apparent, and this is just one tiny example, was that one of the fundamental certifications they needed to get to be able to even put this in anyone's mouth in Australia legally was really difficult to get. And they hadn't really proven that this product could pass that test. And so they kept running into sort of little obstacles and parking it and moving on with all the other stuff they could progress. But they were never going to put this product on any shelf for sale anywhere if they didn't resolve that problem. And it had just sort of been, there were a few things like that where it's like, that's really hard. It's not much fun. And we feel like we're not progressing. So we're going to move on with this other stuff. And I think that wasn't just me. There were a number of new board members that came into that business at that time. But we just said, stop spending that money. You need to come back and you need to fix these, because if you cannot satisfy these compliance requirements, everything else is a waste of time. And there were a couple of board members already there who'd been there from the very beginning. And so there was this desire to keep progressing and to demonstrate to the investors that we're still progressing and we're doing all this stuff and we had the plan and we're moving through the plan. But there were these fundamental little things that just hadn't been, well, they weren't that little, they were big, but they looked little on the project plan, achieve this, achieve that. But they're absolutely fundamental. So I think sometimes it's not just a fresh set of eyes, it's just bringing a different emotional state where you're coming in, you haven't been at that very early stage, you don't have that same emotional pull, which can be seen as a negative as well as a positive, but it does allow you to be very clear-eyed. And I think that can be very helpful at certain stages, so long as that clear-eyedness is not accompanied by, I expect to see everything to be perfect, and that you've still got to recognise what point in maturity is this business at and what's appropriate for it at this time. But yeah, I think that's a really strong value that independent board members can bring into the journey.
That is a perfect segue into question number 6, which is, what does a productive relationship look like between the founder / CEO / business owner, the management team, and investors, the chair, non-executive directors? What is a productive relationship and how should that evolve over time as the company scales?
Well, it can't be productive without strong trust. I've experienced where trust has broken down, and it's
a two-way street, right?
Totally. It's got to be a two-way street. There's plenty of guidance around what breaks trust and what you can do to build trust, but that trust is fundamental. It depends on the ownership structure to an extent, how the relationships work. If you've got investors, a small group of investors, their relationship with management, almost outside of the way the board functions, will be unique to sort of where that business is at and what they want to know about the business because they've got their money in there. that can get quite challenging, I think, where you've got investors who are doing analytics on the business because they want to know what's going on from a mostly financial perspective. You've got a board who are taking a more holistic view of the business. And of course, the finances is important, but they've also got access to different information. So the model that you're in can be very different. If you've got a single owner, that's very different to having institutional investors. Having a larger number of institutional investors is different to having a smaller number. Having a majority owner and some other investors, all these dynamics make for a different relationship between investors, shareholders, board, management, and the chair. The chair role becomes so important in making sure that all of those relationships are working functionally. But I think as a business grows and the board grows, it moves from less formal to more formal. And again, it's that balancing act of the formality is there to make it efficient and effective. And if it's not, then change the way it's working. So, you don't just suddenly impose a very formal environment on something that had been working quite well with less formality. So trust, fundamental, clear roles and expectations. It's just basic management, isn't it? Make sure people understand what the expectation is. But ideally, I think you've got to build a culture of constructive challenge, of open-mindedness and curiosity. So if someone is pushing back on something that you have a strong view about, your response should be, why is that person responding in this way? Not, I'm going to shoot them down because I don't agree with them. If you're in a fast growth business where there's a lot of ambiguity, uncertainty, and by definition that has to be the case from my perspective, you have to have that open-mindedness, that curiosity, that willingness to change your mind. And so constructive challenge amongst all those different parties that you've mentioned is a really fundamental part of those relationships being very effective. And you've got to focus on trust. It's really easy, sometimes just through a misstep, to break trust. So
I totally agree. So I've got a couple of, I want to dig into a couple of areas you just talked about there. And the first thing is I want to share an experience I've had recently as chair of an early stage company. We did our first institutional capital raising. And so one of the things I did was I spoke with the investors as they came on and I said, let's incorporate the metrics that you need to track into our board reporting, right? And so rather than having them working into the business in a separate way through a separate channel, they're board observers and I encourage them to be quite active in the board actually. But then I've also updated the way we do board reporting so that they're getting the data they need, the metrics they need in the format they need so they can report back internally and we're all getting it as well. And so we're all kind of thinking about the business's performance using the same lens, which I think seems to be working well.
And that's so important, Wayne. I think, the investors' primary objectives may be different to the founders. A good example is cash generation. The investors, that may be a really important part of their investment proposition. And for the founder and the way that they've been thinking about the business, it's all about just scraping by, investing, growth, and then suddenly you've got this sort of conflict. So, clarity around what those investor objectives are, what are the metrics, and making sure that everyone understands that, in particular that management understands that. I've certainly run into that sort of friction where you're trying to figure out, we seem to be a bit at odds here and people are responding to certain decisions and scenarios in a way I didn't expect. And then you realise actually, whilst we've got 8 objectives that are the same, there are 2 that are different and they're just really causing difficulty in these decisions. So being able to, have that conversation. And even if me as the founder thinks for the sustainability of this business, that's not the most important thing. But in order for these investors to get what they need and for me to have them investing, I've got to live with the fact that that is important to them and satisfy that. That same set of metrics, I think that makes a huge difference because it causes you to have the discussion about what's important.
I love it. And I think The way you just described it, Jacqui, just made me think a lot about family-owned businesses. Once you
Mhm.
get to a large family-owned business that is growing and you have multiple family members as shareholders, getting around the table and making sure you've got a board that supports the objectives of the shareholders. And if some shareholders are looking for cash generation, some kind of dividend or revenue stream out of the business, and others are looking to grow, then yeah, getting clarity on that, I think, is really important. And brings me to the second point I wanted to make. And I really wanted to dig into your experience as chair here. The role of a chair in a high growth company is really, really important. Do you want to share some of the insights that you've gained being chair in multiple companies?
I think having clarity, well, I think one really important role of the chair when you're first establishing a business, and I was in a kind of weird environment where I was appointed along with two directors and we basically didn't have anyone else. We were gifted some assets and then had to build the business. But I certainly felt it was very important that one of my roles was to set the tone of the business. You know, what is the culture of this business going to be? So, yes, we know what we have to do, but how are we going to go about that? So, I think that is something that as a chair you can really influence because you will make your hiring decisions with that backdrop of, how are we going to go about this?
Both at the board and into the business, right?
Absolutely. You're hiring a CEO, and part of what you're hiring for is values alignment, understanding of what the board's expectation is around the way the business will behave. And then that should flow through. And you need to kind of actively demonstrate those values as the chair. I think the other big thing in a fast growth business is clarity about what matters now and giving confidence to the management team that the board is behind you, that we know that because of this sort of high growth environment that typically you're resource constrained, that there are things that are not going to be perfect and we will live with that and we can cope with that. And then there are other things that we know we have to get right. And they're the things that we are going to focus on. And the chair's job is to make sure people don't get distracted, that you find ways to get rid of that noise and to clear a path so that the management team can get on and do that work. Hold your directors accountable to that because it is very easy for directors to lose sight of the fact that those are the priorities. There's always really interesting stuff you're learning as a director and you think, oh, we might ask management for a report on that, or we might ask them to do this or to do that. And suddenly there's this massive set of tasks for the management team to do just to report back to the board. So as chair, you've got to really make sure that you're not overly burdening the management team with work, that the work you're doing together is absolutely aligned with those priorities and that you're creating value. So I think it's continually pushing away the noise, the unnecessary, and keeping things on track. But I think it is your responsibility to lead the culture and the way we go about our work, to really pay attention to reputation and make sure that, you've got, whether you need social license, but every business needs some sort of informal license to operate, paying attention to some of those things that I think when you're just trying to execute and you're trying to do a lot of things quickly, having someone remind you, hey, we just need to make sure we're doing this in the right way as well. But just,
I love it.
cut the task to where you're at that time. And your job as chair is to absolutely stay true to that and keep everyone else on track.
Hey, looking back, Jacqui, across your portfolio, question number 7 is, what are some of the governance practices that you wish more founders would have introduced earlier?
Well, I've got one pet one. Well, there's two I'd like to mention. One is around risk. So risk appetite is often something that people know they should do. Once a year, we're going to review the risk appetite and we're going to put some statements together and we'll all agree that's the sort of risk we can tolerate. And then we get back to business. So how do you integrate the concept of risk in the decisions that are being made, both by management and then that management are recommending to board? And it's pretty easy, I think, to integrate that into how management's thinking about the business and also the board. Simple things like on the board paper, what is the relationship with the risk appetite statement and any other comment you might want to make? when you're making a decision that you discuss that. You don't just ignore the fact that there's a risk that sits closely to this decision, but we're not bothering to talk about it. If you're not bothering because there's no value in it, it just means that your risk appetite statement isn't the right fit for your business. But I think trying to have risk considered as an integrated part of the decision making is a very powerful thing if you can get it right. The other thing, which we've touched on a bit, is recognizing the type of decision that you're trying to make. So typically, most things that are coming to board, it's for a decision. And where there is uncertainty, and we talked about that a little bit around, don't expect a great big mature business case for something that's got a lot of unknowns. Have a framework for figuring out where that decision sits on that spectrum of uncertainty, because you can apply different methods to fleshing out what that investment is that you're looking for, what you're asking the board to do, what the risk is associated with that decision. What are those uncertainties and what are you going to do about them in order to make the board comfortable to make the next investment decision? So to me, that would be and it's not just in high growth businesses, but particularly in high growth businesses, being really clear. There's, 60% of the decisions are just bog standard. We just use normal methods, whether it's a business case, whether it's a simple board paper. We need this. There's no real uncertainty. Get that decision done. There are some where there is uncertainty and you need the board to understand the risk that they're taking in endorsing that recommendation. And I've seen a $50,000 proposal take up an hour of a board's time, and a $1 million investment in some sort of novel new thing that the business is trying take 5 minutes of the board's time, just because of the way those decisions have been brought to the boardroom. That means the board's not spending their time on the right things and they're probably taking risk on that they're not aware of. So trying to have a simple framework for saying, this is a really uncertain, high-risk decision, and so we're going to treat it in a different way to this really pretty standard mundane. And it doesn't always relate to the amount of spend. A lot of organisations have sort of a high-value, high-risk matrix. So it takes into account, yes, we're spending a lot of money, but there's also a high degree of uncertainty. Or maybe it's low money and low uncertainty. Maybe there's high reputational risk. There's a set of things that you need to think about that tells you how much time the board should be spending on that decision and what sort of information they need to see. That would be my big recommendation, is get a framework like that in place.
So we've just done the 7 questions podcast, but because it's my podcast, I get the prerogative to do a bonus question, right? And so I've got a bonus question for you, which is, I think, given your background and experience and given the things you're working on at the moment, I would like to just delve into board governance around AI. So what are you thinking at the moment and what are you advising boards on? How are you on the board you're on thinking about AI and how's it impacting growth and how's it impacting risk? And yeah, just give us maybe some advice that you would recommend businesses, founders, CEOs and other boards think about when they think about AI.
So I spend a lot of time thinking about this. I'm absolutely sure that I haven't got it right, but I think there's a fundamental question, and it will be the right answer will be different for different types of boards. Should AI be something that you want everyone in the business to be actively thinking about and applying to their part of the business, or is it something that you want a small number of people to spend a lot of time on in a very focused way? Similar discussions are always had about innovation. Do we want everyone to be innovative, or do we just want one little group to do that on behalf of the whole business? And I think you've got to have clarity around that because they're very different prospects. Using AI in the general business, depending on what the business is, to lift up productivity, whether it's using Copilot, whether it's using it, really in anger versus just kind of taking suggestions from it occasionally. What are you expecting people to do? So I think that general adopting the corporate tools that are being offered and training people in it, that's kind of, to me, that's just like business as usual. It's just that we've got
Table
some new
stakes, right?
The area that I think can suck a lot of time and resource, so money, people, and management brain space is where you're really trying to apply AI into your business, whether it's agentic AI, whether it's, trying to automate particular parts of the business outside of that sort of just, Microsoft Copilot
Yep. Basic
uplift.
productivity.
And what I've seen work well is that you have a budget for investing in AI and that you are really disciplined about being clear about either the problem you're trying to solve or the opportunity you're trying to seize that you think AI can do for your business. Now, those ideas may come from the whole business, but having a way to gather that, prioritize, and then say, we're going to invest in these 5. We're going to run a disciplined process of experimentation so that the ones that are never going to work, we find those fatal flaws early and we kill them off. But the ones that have promise, we're going to continue to invest in, but it's going to be run as an experiment. And we expect most of them to fail because these are all sort of high risk, very novel things that we're trying, but there'll be some that work. But we're going to really control what those things are that we're working on. They're going to align to the strategic priorities of the business. And we are going to have a very disciplined way of making incremental investment into that space. We're going to train those people properly so they can really do the job well. We're going to get the right resources in. This isn't just some sideshow. This is a fundamental part of our strategy. I think you can still have some space for people to just play around because often from that play comes some brilliant thought that no one had. But that can't be your main approach, I don't think. That's just what I've seen work well. When you're running a business, it's growing fast, everyone's busy, you've got your day job to do. How do you make good investment in AI and the potential of AI in your business? So that's my experience.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing. And I think more and more boards are going to grapple with what's the right approach to AI? How much do we invest? Do we roll it out across the entire business? Do we have a team doing it? Is this a general productivity thing? Is this a transformation thing? Is this a market capture thing? So, yeah, I think your words of wisdom are really relevant. Thank you. Hey, before we go, it's time for 7 rapid fire questions. These are questions about, in your experience, what's the right answer for high growth companies? So are you ready? Great. Founder, investor, or independent chair?
Independent chair.
Experience or diversity? Which one do you prefer on the board?
Both. And experience. If I had to go with one, it would be diversity, I think.
You get to
I've
go
just
with
been
one.
in too many environments where there's too much groupthink.
I totally agree. Monthly, bi-monthly, or quarterly board meetings?
Monthly.
Online or in person?
In person for strategic and thinking, and then you can do online for admin and more mundane things, more routine things.
Love it. One attribute you look for in a great growth company director?
Curiosity and
Love it.
open mind. Yes.
Perfect. Formal board or advisory board?
I think for a high growth business at the very early stage, advisory is probably the way I'd go and mature that into a more formal governance board.
Is there a trigger to move to a governance board or a formal board for a high growth company?
The minute you're taking someone else's money, you probably need a governance board.
Makes sense.
Which, it depends. If you're in a highly regulated environment, you probably might like to have a governance board.
Yep.
If you're in a business where you could kill people, a governance board would be good.
Question number 7. One word that describes a great growth company board.
Productively energetic.
I'll give it to you.
Very long word.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and your thoughts with our community about the journey that organisations go on when they're growing quickly, and what's the right time and stage to build governance and a board into the way they approach their business? How does it help? What are some of the lessons that they should look out for? What makes a good board, relationships, and so on? Jacqui, you've shared heaps of wisdom with us today. Thank you. I know you do a fair amount of advisory and you help growth companies get their board set up. Is it okay if I put your contact details in the show notes? Because I'm sure some people might like to reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love that, Wayne. Yes. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you. It's such an important area, I think. And there's nothing better than seeing entrepreneurs being successful with new businesses. I love being a part of it, but I love the role you've been playing, Wayne, particularly in our Queensland business landscape. But thanks for inviting me onto this podcast.
Jacqui, fantastic to have you on 7 Questions. Look forward to releasing this show, and please reach out to Jacqui on social media and feel free to engage with us when we release the podcast. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for listening to this episode of 7 Questions. If you'd like to learn more about the founders, you can get a link to the full show notes in the description below. Have a great day. We look forward to you joining us on the next episode.